What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So today we're going to be skipping Windlord completely and going straight to AMBERSHAPER. The reason for this is that Windlord is an incredibly boring, straightforward, and easy healing boss. It does like some, significant tank damage depending on the spec. Some specs, are immortal with their vengeance on that encounter and all like the funnel from all the ads and stuff, but some specs like maybe Prot Warrior, Paladin, if they're doing the shield reset thing, might need a little bit more help, but that fight is basically 1 to 0 healable on both 10 and 25 man, with the only dangerous healing in the entire encounter being the Rain of Blades, which is, you probably are only going to get 2 if you're quick, and basically any healing cooldown can cover it from any player, including DPS, so things like AG, VE, obviously incredible with the damage amp. Those can just cover that completely, DPS, healing, tide totems, etc. So very boring fight. Definitely if you're the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc. healer on that fight, just go off spec. Or if you have fun just DPS parse cheesing, you can do that as well. But yeah, that fight is so boring and straightforward, I'm just not going to bother talking about it too much. And we're going to go straight to AMBERSHAPER, which I think is a much more interesting healer fight. However, the phase 1 here is pretty low damage, so it's kind of boring. And if you're wiping a lot in phase 1, this can be kind of a boring healing fight to progress. So that's that. Let's quickly go over the main healing relevant mechanics on this encounter. For the phase 1, there's the beam, which goes out on ranged. You just dodge it, you just, drag it around. What I'll say for a lot of healers, if you have a good movement speed cooldown like Feather or Dash or whatever for a Druid, you can just run around in a circle and the beam won't hit you, and you can drop all the ads in one spot, which is kind of nice. You don't have to drag it off into Africa and have all the ads spawn super far away from all your cleave. You can just keep it like pretty close to the boss, just run in a circle. The beam will spawn these ads called living ambers here. I'm gonna back up actually to the beginning. And you can see what these ads do is when they die, they explode and do some AoE in like, I think it's 10, 15 yards. That will also heal the other slimes, which is actually kind of nice because it means they don't often line up and overlap their damage, which could be quite dangerous. The fact that they heal each other means it's unlikely you get overlaps. However, it is possible if the ads die close enough together in time that the heal won't proc, and you can get 2 or 3 overlapping explosions. However, in all the pulls I've ever pulled on this boss, it's only ever killed like 1 person. So that's the second mechanic, is these oozes. Again, a good opportunity because this is kind of the only raid damage. You definitely want to sync up your AoE heals with those explosions. You don't need to just send them on cooldown because there's no raid damage other than that. The third mechanic, which is the most interesting and complicated, I'm actually going to back up here. Actually, no, there one just went out there. So you can see this parasite dot that goes out here. This is a healing gimmick mechanic. It's kind of complicated, and a lot of people are going to make a big hullabaloo about this, but basically in any comp in 25 man, in the vast majority of compositions in 10 man, you can basically completely ignore this mechanic entirely, and it should never kill anyone outside of maybe phase 3. And the reason for that, the one quick secret that all doctors hate or whatever, is going to be Hand of Purity. This is a 30-second cooldown hand spell. It's costs some mana, and what this does is reduces damage over time effects on the target by 90%. So this is a full diffuse, full dispersion, quasi immunity, and it lasts 6 seconds, and it has a 30-second cooldown. So this should be up for basically every dot. As long as you use this in the last 6 seconds, it's very important that you save it for the last 6 seconds so it covers the last few ticks. The dot can get up to 300,000, 400,000 per tick. This will just solo it and make the player never die. So if you have a Paladin, which should be quite easy in basically every 25-man comp, very rare you won't have a Paladin. A little bit tougher in 10-man, especially if your Paladin is a Prot Paladin and they don't want to drop their CD reduction on shield wall. Although for this encounter, I would definitely have your Prot Paladin just suck it up and take Hand of Purity, because this literally removes the mechanic entirely from the game. So that's one version of the fight, kind of similar to Garrulon, right? There's one version of the fight where you have a Holy Paladin, or a Paladin rather, and a second version of the fight, which is hard mode. If you are playing the hard mode version of this fight with no Paladin, then this mechanic actually exists. And what you want to be doing here is using absorbs on this player early and often. So this means Power Word Shield. You can see I chucked a Power Word Shield on him there. If there had been raid damage coming out when this dot went out, I would have been much quicker with that Power Word Shield, putting it on there instantly. You can also see what I'm doing here is I'm using my Spirit Shell as a single target ability. I'm not POHing the raid. You don't need to POH the raid, especially in phase 1. It just is not super effective. I'm using my Spirit Shell exclusively to manage this dot. And generally speaking, since Spirit Shell is a 1-minute cooldown, you want to save it for a dot that gets a little bit out of control. I kind of just sent it here just to send it. You know, generally speaking, if this dot gets to like 90, 100k early, just use your Spirit Shell, hit him with a couple of greater heals, you know, use your inner focus. Also, with your passive abilities, your single target heals will reduce the duration of weak soul on the target by 2 seconds each, which means you can, you know, get more powered shields on them as well, just for extra safety. When it comes to absorbs from other healers, you can of course also use illuminated healing from a paladin. However, spamming into a dot target for just illuminated healing, not advisable. And the other thing that's big here is going to be Chi Cocoon. However, Chi Cocoon is a much longer cooldown, and so you're going to have to be much more selective about using it only in emergencies when they're going to die if they don't get it. Also, when it comes to externals, don't be afraid to use hand sack, pain suppression, vigilance, you know, anything like that on the player with the dot, especially in phase 1, because you don't need those cooldowns for anything else. So just letting them go to waste and letting that player die is really bad. Although I will say, Guardian Spirit specifically, this dot just seems to go right through Guardian Spirit. I've had somebody die with GS on them with this dot before, so GS, not a great option for this dot, but basically every other external is great. So that's it. That's literally all the mechanics on this fight for healers. Phase 2, you have a second goopy looking boss here. Nothing really changes. The one thing I'll say on this part of the fight is that if this explosion is about to go off, you can heroically save the pull by pre-using a cooldown. So if the person in the construct calls like, oh, I can't get it or something, if you use any kind of cooldown, especially like a Holy Paladin's or a Mastery or whatever, something like that has big range on it, you can't really do like Barrier, but any kind of DR cooldown like that, you can save, because this explosion doesn't like super overkill you, so any cooldown will generally let most people live from this. Specifically for Priest, if you grip the tank as they get flung, sometimes it won't stun, sometimes it will. I haven't really figured out like what the logic is when it does and doesn't stun. I'm actually going to go to 25-man POV here just to show you the fling grip here. So I believe this one might stun us. So you can see I'm waiting for this fling cast. It should be coming up here pretty soon. Yeah, you can see fling goes out there. I run in a little bit. I grip the tank in and it doesn't stun. So sometimes when you grip the tank in, it will stun you, which is really weird. But like I found like basically 80% of the time it doesn't. So that's kind of nice. You can also get it like kind of early and get them when they just get knocked, which is much better than waiting till the end there. The other thing you can do with grip here is grip melee in after they get knocked, which can sometimes give them a little bit more uptime or whatever if it's a melee that doesn't have a good gap closer. So one more thing to mention for the fling and the knockback here is that if you are a healer that likes to be in melee range, so Paladin, Mistweaver, you can always just instantly use your Goblin Glider when you get knocked back, and that will negate 1 knockback, which can give you a little bit of an increase here. Also, you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to go back actually to look at this beam. You can see I get the beam, I feather myself, and I just run in a tight circle. And you can see I'm not getting hit, and I'm spawning all the oozes in one spot so they can easily get cleaved. Ideally, you know, it would be a little bit closer to the boss there, but that's something that you can super easily do, which is quite useful. And you know, most people kind of panic and they just run off into Africa and drop all the ads like a million miles away. But if you get it as a priest or really any healer, as long as you have a decent sprint, you can just run around in circles and drop them all in one spot. When it comes to damage in phase 2, there's not a lot of it. The knockback doesn't do too much damage. The fling, does a little bit of a stun. You can see there, I think he heroic leapt back in, and sometimes when you do that, it stuns and sometimes it doesn't. So it's a little bit inconsistent again there with like movement abilities, a little bit odd. So yeah, phase 2, not a huge amount of damage. Basically, I would save your cooldowns for emergency explosions. So the biggest and best one for that is revival. So if an explosion goes off accidentally, you just hit revival. You're going to keep anyone from getting instantly overlapped, killed by like an ad exploding or something like that. Things like him are a little bit worse because the first tick takes a long time, but healing Tide Totem actually does tick instantly, so similar to a revival there. Just be on the lookout for those random explosions. Other than that, there's nothing that, like, there's no damage that needs to be cooldown for the entire, like, first 2 phases of the fight, really. So unless you're dropping healers very aggressively, in which case you could use those cooldowns to cover, like, an ad spawn with the AoE raid damage, you can kind of just hold your cooldowns for emergencies. And, you know, if you're parsing, obviously send them just on cooldown because the fights are kind of long. But for progression, I would just hold your cooldowns. One thing to mention for phase 2 is that the damage on the raid goes up a little bit, and you also still keep getting parasite dots. Where these dots are like super not dangerous in phase 1, where the damage is quite low, they will become more and more dangerous as the fight goes on, especially in phase 3. And so if you have players with any kind of immunity, things like bubble or cloak, which can completely remove this dot, it doesn't go through immunities, you should definitely be saving those for as late as possible. So obviously if you're gonna die, you can bubble it off, but you generally want to be keeping those longer CD immunities, like, you know, ice block, bubble, for the end of the fight. So let's skip forward to phase 3 here. So generally speaking, most strategies are going to be pushing into phase 3 with high damage stacks on the boss. This means that like any kind of damage conversion is really nice. And this is going to be the highest damage part of the fight. But again, as I mentioned before, there's not really anything that pressures your healing cooldowns in phase 1 or phase 2 other than accidental explosions, which can usually be covered by one single cooldown, especially revival and healing tide. So you should have an enormous amount of healing cooldowns for this. You can see I'm hemming here. You know, I think we have 5-6 healers in this group, so you can have a cooldown running the entire time, both DR things like, you know, AM, rally, and also healing cooldowns. You should be able to chain, if you have 5 healers, healing cooldowns for the entirety of this phase. So while the damage is very, very high here, it shouldn't be dangerous. So once you do make it into phase 3 with enough people alive, this should be a kill. One thing to mention here, as you can see in this fight, these balls come out. These are incredibly dangerous. This is your main wipe condition for the end of this fight, is just these balls touching the people they're focused on. And something to keep in mind here is that the people that are kiting out, you can see 2 people are targeted. It should show up on your raid frames if you have Fogies. If these players die, and it's very likely that they will die as they'll be outside of all the stacked up healing, the orbs refocus. You can see this one refocuses on me, and I'm going to wait a little bit too long there, and then I'm going to boots out. So just be very, very, very careful. Obviously, everyone should be careful of this, but, you know, as a healer, especially if you're tunnel visioning your raid frames and you get one of those balls, it's much better to run out of the raid and not, you know, explode and just do 0 healing than it is to do more healing and get hit by the ball and wipe the raid. So that's the last thing I'll say to be super, super vigilant about. And again, because you have so many cooldowns, it's not a big deal if 1 or 2 of your healers have to run out for those, because your HPS should be so high on the raid with a high enough healer count that it doesn't really matter. To go over logs on this fight, because of the damage amp, we can see Mistweavers are actually incredibly strong on this encounter. In 25-man, you can see they're like topping all the logs. We can also see specs like Shaman and Holy Priest, unsurprisingly being very high here with their very powerful raid cooldowns for that last phase, as well as just good raw HPS output. Although it's not a great Holy Priest fight because it does so little damage until P3 that you can't really take advantage of all the rot healing you do as a Holy Priest. Disc Priest also quite high up here, again because of that damage amplification, making Atonement quite strong. So a really good Disc Priest fight, not only because of the damage amp, but because, again, Spirit Shell, Power Word Shield, very, very powerful on that dot, especially if you don't have a Paladin. If you do have a Paladin, it doesn't matter. You don't need a Disc Priest. In this GDKP, I just played Holy, and it didn't matter because we had a Paladin. Our Holy Paladin was very on top of, you can see me coining a weapon there. Our Holy Paladin was super on top of Hand of Purity, and he just completely soloed the dot, and it never killed anyone. For Holy Paladin, you can see Selfless Healer doing well here in 25-man. If we look at 10-man, we can see it's a very similar breakdown here where it's just going to be lots and lots of Mistweavers. Very, very good Mistweaver fight for HPS just because they can do their damage amp, they can cleave onto all of the oozes. All that cleave is like instant smart healing on the melee who are going to be taking all the damage from the ooze pop. So you will steal the vast majority of all the HPS for the first 2 phases. And also Revival is incredibly good at sniping those accidental explosions. When it comes to builds for priests, first row doesn't matter, and then of course always Feather. For your 45 row here, I'd take Solace because the damage conversion and the damage amplification makes this, like the increased atonement healing from your Holy Var quite strong. Also for Holy, you just always take this in my view. For your 60 row, when usually it doesn't matter which one of these you take, You should never ever in a million years take Angelic Bulwark on this encounter because it can proc while you're inside of the like transformation, amalgamation, whatever thing. Always, always, always take Desperate Prayer, or you could take Spectral Guise if you just like being edgy and living in the shadows or whatever. 75 row, always Twist of Fate. Your 90 row here is a little bit interesting. I'll just take Divine Star because it's incredible in phase 3. But you could also take Halo. Not a terrible Halo fight, so either one of these is fine, but I think most of the top parses will have Divine Star just because that's how parsing works and how Divine Star works. It just scales way higher than all the other spells. Your glyphs here, I'd take Inner Sanctum just for like the taking magical damage, or Discipline, I would just always take Penance here, and then for your third glyph, you can take whatever. I probably wouldn't take Palm just because there's decent ticking damage, but you could take something like Smite for damage. You could take Holy Fire if you're ever ranging, which you probably shouldn't be, but really, these are the only two important glyphs for Holy. You want to take Inner Sanctum as well. You want to take, instead of Penance, something like Deep Wells. And then for your third glyph, you could take like Circle of Healing here, actually. For phase 3, this is going to increase your rot output. And also for phase 1, this is going to help you top those ooze bursts up. And the mana increase doesn't really matter for this fight. For Mistweaver, this is actually a pretty interesting one. I'd take Tiger's Lust just to do that dodging the beam easier. For 30 row, actually interesting here. I think all the HPS bars will just be taking Chi Burst because it's great in P3. But I think if you want a little bit of damage and a little bit of healing, I'd actually just take Zen Sphere here. It's going to be a good mix. It's going to help you cleave on the oozes. It's going to do decent AoE healing, decent AoE damage. And it's just, I find this spell fun to play with. I probably wouldn't play Chi Wave on this encounter, but one of these two is going to be fine. You can see for HPS, it's going to be mostly Chi Burst here. Actually, some Chi Wave there. Nobody plays Zen Sphere but me, but I do think it's actually a decent option on this encounter. 45 is just always Chi Brew. 60 row doesn't really matter. You could take Leg Sweep to like Leg Sweep the oozes, but it kind of doesn't really matter. For 75 row, always Diffuse on this encounter. This lets you ignore the dot if it goes on yourself. For 90 row here, it's actually decently equal, I think. Rushing Jade Wind and Tiger are both going to do pretty high HPS and very high damage on this encounter, so Tiger, it's going to cleave all the oozes, it's going to do big damage on the boss with the damage amp, it's going to do big healing as well, and then you can pop a second one later in the fight, either like in P3, or, you know, you can always pop it in P2 and have it do some more cleave. I think the rank 1 HPS log here, which is Steel Chi, yeah, he did play Tiger, and he pressed it on pull and then at 3 minutes. So like in that P2, he didn't wait for like Lust in the end of the fight. But both of these options are fine. Rushing Jade Wind, you can see also doing quite strong HPS. You can see both of these logs also doing similar damage, with the Rushing Jade Wind doing like 130k DPS and the Tiger doing like 145. So similar damage there. These fight lengths are also like relatively similar. This is a little bit shorter, so damage is going to look a little bit better. What I would say is that Rushing Jade Wind is going to give you more consistent healing, obviously. It's going to give you a little bit more consistent cleave. You're going to have this cleave up for every single ad spawn. So this plus Blackout Kick is going to just blend up those ads and do crazy, like rot healing to the melee. Whereas Tiger can give you a little bit more damage, but a little bit less consistent healing. So it's kind of just personal preference, honestly. Not a huge difference on this encounter. Chi Torpedo is also like kind of cool here. If you can get it on like 20 players or whatever, it's decent. It's decent in phase 3, but because there's a big damage amp on this boss and this doesn't really do damage, and in phase 1 and phase 2, like the healing from this and the amount of targets you're going to hit, it's not going to be super high. I would just always take one of these two options. For glyphs here, it's just monk glyphs, so it doesn't really matter. You could take like Rem, you could take your Flash Heal glyph, you could take, actually I probably would take Zen Med. The one thing I'll say here, though, is that if you do take Tiger, you should take Glyph of Spinning Crane Kick just so you can move around better while you're cleaving. And when it comes to your cast profile on this fight, you can basically spend the entirety of phase 1 and phase 2 just spamming Blackout Kick and doing big cleave on all the ads. Your positioning is going to be pretty important, that you position like so you can either cleave off the boss with the damage amp onto the ads, or go out to the ads and just do cleave. You want to be remming on CD and just spamming Blackout Kick pretty hard here. Not really like a huge amount of uplifts here, and you can kind of just like Thunder Focus T on CD. However, in phase 1, you can potentially delay it a little bit to line up with like a ad spawning. For Paladin here, I'd take Speed of Light just so you can kite the beam a little bit better. 30 row doesn't really matter. 45 row, 10 man, you're probably playing Eternal Flame. 25 man, you're probably playing Selfless Healer, but they're pretty interchangeable. Sacred Shield, you might think this would be like decent for the dot, but I just don't think it's worth it. 60 row, again, just play Hand of Purity. Even if you're a tank and you want your shorter CD on like Shield Wall or whatever, this just makes the encounter so much, it removes an entire mechanic, which is just invaluable. Although again, if you're prop Paladin, it's a little bit less consistent because you might be in the little ooze thing. So 75 row, again, always Holy Avenger. 90 row, this is a good fight for Light's Hammer. I don't think the damage jump works on Holy Prism. I could be wrong though, correct me in the comments if you know. For Glyphs, you're just gonna run like the standard HPS setup of Hand Sack, Beacon, and then Glyph of Divinity, or potentially for EF, you could run Glyph of Flash of Light. You could potentially run something like Harsh Words to do a little bit more damage in phase 1, because again, your healing doesn't really matter in that phase, especially if you're 4 or 5 healing. So some options there. And again, to just cap off the Hand of Purity talk here a little bit, very important that you wait for the last 6 seconds of the dot. If you do it a little bit too early and the last tick of the dot is super high, the person can die. So it's generally better to use your Hand of Purity a little bit late than it is to use it early. So just definitely wait for the last 6 seconds, especially if the dot's like super high. And don't be afraid to just like hard spam into the dot target. If it's like 300k, they're getting super chunked and it's, you know, the dot maybe has 9-10 seconds left. You can hard spam into them for 3 or 4 seconds and then Hand of Purity, and they shouldn't die. Of course, again, you can use your Hand Sack, pain suppression, things like that on them as well. For Druid here, movement row doesn't really matter too much. 30 row, always Ysera's Gift. 45 row, again, doesn't matter. 60 row, although maybe you could Typhoon the oozes to like get them a bit stacked better, but I don't know, it doesn't really matter too much. For 60 row here, I would take Soul of the Forest. Incarn like could be kind of interesting if you're very low healing count and you need an extra CD for phase 3, but generally speaking, Soul of the Forest is just like overall the best talent row here. Force of Nature also kind of cool, just, you know, it's like Soul of the Forest, but a little bit worse. 75 row doesn't really matter. You could potentially Vortex like the oozes into a better position. I don't even know if they're Vortexable though. For 90 row here, Heart of the Wild's kind of cool because you can blast damage for the entirety of phase 1 with Heart of the Wild, and then you should potentially have it up for phase 3 again. We can see here that most of these kill times are going to be sub 6 minutes, which is going to be a little bit worse for Heart of the Wild. However, if you're running a strategy where you delay damage on the main boss to get big stacks or something like that, and your kill time's over 6 minutes, Heart of the Wild becomes much better. But generally speaking, I'd probably just run Nature's Vigil here. It's just default the best choice for HPS. And for Glyphs, we're Resto Druid, so 2 of our Glyph slots are just completely locked in, and then for a 3rd slot, you probably just run Glyph of Regrowth at this gear level. When it comes to the question of like to snapshot or not to snapshot here, it's kind of a moot point because you're going to be lusting at the end for most strategies. So, you know, again, doesn't really matter. You can't get that lust snapshot in, but you can Zerk on the pull. And if you do something like pulling the boss to one spot like this and just keeping it camped there, which most people are going to do, you can always like snapshot your Berserk into your first F-low and leave it there. But generally speaking, just Zerk is not like enough to make the snapshot worth it here. So you can see like this high parse bloomed consistently. I would bloom more than this, honestly. I'd bloom like anytime 2 ads line up and pop and the melee are like below 90%, you can just pop your mushroom and replace it. So a good fight for mushroom blooming and not a great fight for snapshotting. However, you can snapshot, like if you have a Zerk, you can use your Zerk early and then you can have a Zerk up for when you lust, you press Zerk and you drop your Shroom, and then you can just kind of leave your efflorescence for the remainder of that bloodlust, and then maybe you pop it at the very end here. Also, a little bit of a downside to hot healers on this fight is that if you have a bunch of hots out on like the melee or something, and a melee gets a dot, and they have a bunch of hots stacked up on them, they will get extra stacks of the dot. But again, if you have a Paladin in the group, that doesn't matter. But if you're in like a 10-man or something where you don't have a Paladin with Hand of Purity, it can be very useful to get your DPS to have a cancel aura macro with cancel aura all of your hots. So if you're a druid, you know, things like cancel aura rejuve, cancel aura wild growth, cancel aura renew if you have a priest, things like that, although basically no priests press renew. So cancel aura, you know, renewing mists, things like that. You can just kind of get a macro that has all those in it, stack them up, give it to your DPS, although the odds that your DPS will actually use that macro quickly enough that it matters is so low that I almost wouldn't really bother with that, honestly. But if you are having big trouble with the dot specifically, that's something you could do. Lastly, for Shaman here, you probably just take Astral Shift. Stone Bulwark Totem is like kind of a HPS parse cheese option a little bit, maybe. Nature's Guardian, I believe this also has a similar effect to Bulwark, where it will proc if you're in the dude. I haven't like used it or seen anybody use it, but I do think it does work that way, so just never take this. which is fine, right? Astral Shift and Stone Bulwark are both good options. For your 30 row, doesn't matter. For your 45 row, there's nothing to like Windwalk Totem here, and neither of these really matter. For your 45 row, Call the Elements is going to be your highest HPS increase, but you can also just as well take Totemic Persistence. Projection's not really useful here. 60 row, I would take EM, but of course you can take AS if you prefer it, or if it gets you to an important haste break point. 75 row, just always conductivity on this fight. It's a great conductivity fight, and it has to be a very bad conductivity fight for this not to be takeable. For your 90 row, Primal Ellie is going to give you big damage. Phase 1, there's nothing really happening, so you can kind of just drop your Ellies for damage. I like Elemental Blast because I'm a freak, and I find this fun. Having an Earth Ellie up for Phase 3, you can drop it in the end of Phase 2, and empower yourself, and having 20% DR for the entirety of like the end of Phase 2 and all of Phase 3 is very powerful defensively. When it comes to glyphs, Telluric Currents is locked in, but for our next two options, I'd probably take like Eternal Earth, just for, the mana efficiency. This is like overall a pretty high HPS increase from a glyph relative to the other glyphs. And then for your last glyph, I'd definitely take HST here. There's just a lot of nature damage going out, so 10% DR on your like big healing thing is great. Not any crazy tech here. When it comes to where to place your ground effects like Healing Rain, you just like Phase 1, you just want to have them on the melee because that's who's going to be taking all the damage from the oozes exploding. That's really the only raid damage. And then Phase 2, you kind of just similarly want to put them on the big melee stack. Generally speaking, the range are going to be spread out enough where you probably won't be hitting 6 with your rain, so it's not really worth it. Also, the range don't really take much damage, so yeah, definitely your healing circles just kind of go standard position under the melee. You can also try to clip the tanks with them to get some extra tank healing. So that's Ambershaper. Again, not a hugely complicated healing boss if you have a Paladin in the raid. And if you don't have a Paladin in the raid, then you're going to have to start bending over backwards to do things like have a cancel or a hot macro, have the player not stand in Healing Rain, maybe cancel your statue on a Mistweaver and don't do smart healing, just do single target healing. Because things like Eminence, Atonement, if the player is standing in AoE damage from the oozes and standing in Healing Rain, Sanctuary, and getting Atonement, Smart Healing, and Eminence, Smart Healing, they will stack up very quickly, and that can be very dangerous. So there's a Paladin version of this fight, and then there's hard mode, and in that hard mode, you might have to do things like, just grip the DPS player out if they have the dot and tell them not to move, and they won't die. So that's the guide. If you got value, if you're entertained, if you learned something, send a like, subscribe, comment for the algorithm, or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.